Hello and welcome. Today we're talking about the Windows Firewall. So Windows Firewall actually consists of a few different things. More importantly, when we say Windows Firewall, typically we're looking at the Windows Defender Firewall. It's a very basic view of it, but it's not the only way to view the content. You can actually look at the Windows Firewall with advanced security or advanced settings. And that's actually where we're going to be dealing with more granular control of the Windows Firewall. So to understand some of these basics is, Windows Firewall is a software-based firewall. It allows you to turn on and turn off private or public networks, block certain incoming sources or block certain incoming requests, programs, ports, things of that nature. You can also block all incoming connections. Windows Defender Firewall with advanced security, this is more practical. This is where you can reduce risk. This is where you can configure a lot more of the settings. This is actually where you can define a lot better scope of what's happening. And you do that by doing rules. Rules are going to either be inbound or outbound. And again, inbound are things coming into the system. Outbound is going to be things leaving the system. By default, there are many rules that are just disabled because they're not really needed at the moment. You can create a new rule by going to them, going to either inbound or outbound, right-click, and new rule. We also have a connection security rule, and this is where we can configure certain types of connections. To isolate, to authenticate, if we're dealing with server to server, or to tunnel. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these as we look at them. Lastly, we have the ability to monitor the certain types of selection of what's going on. So the monitoring, you can also be attached to a profile, the domain profile, private or public profiles. So these are going to be the location profiles, which will be determined what settings are specifically enforced in the monitoring section. Alright, so let's jump in and let's see what we can do. Alright, so I'm inside my Windows 10 machine. First thing is I'm going to type firewall. Well, first thing that should pop up should be like firewall network and protection. Then it should say the Windows Defender Firewall. So that's what I want. I want to look at the Windows Defender Firewall. This can also be accessed through Control Panel. And this, you're going to notice private networks, guest or public networks, and some of the settings. If you want to play with these types of settings, you can, over here on the left-hand side, you can either turn them on or turn them off. A lot of people, when you're doing a lab, say to turn off the firewall, and then you can see that they're red. Problem is, that really doesn't help us. Instead of disabling the firewall, it's a little bit better to just configure it correctly. That's one thing that I get irritated with when we do labs, is a lot of people will turn off the firewall. In real world scenarios, you're not disabling the firewall, you're dealing with a firewall that's already there, and you're just going to be working around it. You can change the way that things are notified, block incoming connections. You can do that. You can notify them if you want. We already looked at the turn on and turn off. You can restore the defaults. And then lastly is this advanced. The advanced is going to load the Windows Defender Firewall with advanced security. This is where we're going to be doing most of our work. So inbound, you can actually look at what's running. These are all the ones, green check marks, those are the ones that are enabled. If there's no green check mark, that means they're not really enabled. So we have things like RDP. Remote assistance is enabled, but RDP is not. So first thing I want to do is go to System, I want to turn Remote Desktop on. Even though it's on, one of the interesting parts is it will listen to that port, but until we actually allow the firewall rule in, it won't. And you'll notice all I did was refresh, and it had these 3 rules enabled. Windows Firewall is smart enough to turn certain features on or off based off of whatever action we do. So that was actually really important. Alright, so let's go through and let's create a new rule. So new rule, you can filter off a program, a port, predefined setting, or a custom rule. A program, you could actually list specific programs to the exe, like you have FileZilla, an FTP server program. You can link all the way to the application and allow it in that way. Or you can go to port and you can say UDP or TCP and what ports. You could also do predefined and see if FTP is in here. And FTP is not. This is going to be predominantly Windows features, which Windows components are actually here. Like MDNS isn't Windows feature, but that's a pretty common feature that a lot of people need allowing on. So these are going to be the common ones and Windows features. Custom rule is also there, so I'm going to do custom rule. And custom rule, you can list the application, because again, this is more open-ended. You could also do a service if it applies to a service. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to go to port. I'm going to allow TCP port 21. You know what? 20 through 21. I'm going to allow the connection. I'm going to allow it to all of my profiles, domain, private, and public. And I will allow this for FTP inbound, TCP port 20 through 21. Alright, so the reason I did it like this is, one, I want to... Oh, not what I wanted. I wanted to list the description. What am I doing? The rule, inbound or outbound. The transportation type, TCP or UDP. And then the ports. That way, as I quickly want to reference them, I can. Well, the nice thing is, when you create the rule, this is how you would do it. I always want to look at the properties of the rule. So go to the rule that you created. Double click on it so we can see the properties. General is going to give us the allower block, but the scope is one of the important ones. You can actually filter off of IP addresses here as well. We have our our protocols. We already said TCP, and we said what ports. Our scope is our addresses. We have an advanced. We can change or modify the profiles or the interfaces. You can attach it to specific users or exceptions. You can also, again, tie it to authorized users for external. Remote computers, same thing. Or you can attach it to a program. At this point, it kind of just depends on what you're doing. Normally, I'm filtering off of an incoming request, and I want to only allow connections from certain devices. So I have more granular control. But it really just depends. Like an FTP server, for example, I may put the scope, and I would put, specific addresses. But that means if I try to connect to that FTP server from a different address, it's not going to work. So we have to be careful when we do this. I actually had one client that was very strict on security controls, and what they did was, when I opened up FTP, I could only open up FTP to their specific IPs. So every time their IP changed, I'd have to go in here and modify the rules. It was cumbersome, but that was their security policy. And we actually have a lab covering the monitoring and the connection security rules, so I'm going to leave those for our labs. This is mainly more monitoring and seeing what we can view from our connections. So we can see certain data as it comes in, and only when we actually have an active rule being applied. So this is, again, basic firewalls within Windows in a nutshell. Nothing too in-depth, nothing too drastic, but enough to get you started. If you have any questions, any concerns, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.